Okay, let me put this video into some context for our unit. This narrative is going to be about the story of psychology, or really a brief history. I'm not going to get into a lot of details here. Um, but we already looked at the kind of the biological foundations. We're looking at the nervous system and the brain and the endocrine system. Uh, we are looking at the biological explanations for behavior. So this is one aspect of psychology, but one kind of phrase or important sentence from that whole chapter was that, all human behavior is rooted in some biological process that is occurring in the brain. So that's kind of why I started with the biology, and we will return to a discussion of many of the different structures in the brain when we talk about perception or memory or motivation. Um, all of those have biological roots. Um, but I also want to talk about today about sort of how psychology grew from Aristotle all the way through to how the current science is viewed, and some of the larger questions that psychologists wrestle with, and then a couple other videos we'll talk more about two people in particular, Freud and Skinner. So the roots and the psychology developing as a science. Then we'll take a look at subfields, levels of analysis, those kinds of things. So we want to kind of move away from maybe how psychologists are viewed in popular culture, movies, television, that kind of thing. That it's often inaccurate and does not come close to covering the breadth of work that psychologists do in a variety of fields. So we can go all the way back to Aristotle, who philosophized, is that a word, about kind of the mind and the brain debates, whether or not we are born with kind of certain ideas, or he might have called the soul, or where did the soul and body grow out of experience. And that continues to be a debate in psychology in terms of what we're kind of born with, or what capabilities we're born with, versus how experience kind of shapes different aspects of our behavior. But it wasn't until 1879 in Germany that a psychologist by the name of Wilhelm Wundt, who is kind of known as a fundamentalist when it comes to psychology, and he did really a reaction time experiment, and then he used a term called introspection. So he was kind of observing people's reaction time, but then he was also interested in what was going on in their head. So through this process of introspection, which is really no more than a reflection on maybe how you might have done something or arrived at a decision. Then, so he was in Germany. We had William James and Mary Calkins, who were in the United States. William James wrote the first psych textbook. And then we had Sigmund Freud, who was in Austria, but not really into the, he was a physician at first, and he later he developed his kind of psychological principles about personality development and defense mechanisms and psychosexual development, and controversial for sure, but really gave a lot of food for thought to a lot of psychologists at the time and thereafter. So, we had all this going on in Germany, United States, Austria. We had all these people just kind of thinking about psychological concepts, and but it wasn't until the 1920s that psychology was defined as the science of mental life. So it was really kind of what was going on in the head. Then some people believed that what was going on in the head, because at the time, you really didn't have any technology, that you didn't have any MRIs, you didn't have any EEGs, You didn't have any PET scans, those kinds of things, to look inside the mind. So you were really just kind of guessing uh, about human behavior. So John Watson, and later B.F. Skinner, but John Watson particularly, believed that for psychology to be a science, to be a respected science, that psychologists could only look at observable behavior, something that you could watch and even more than just watch, but somehow measure in some way. And that's where behaviorism or behaviorist or behavioral psychology really focuses on that observable, measurable behavior as a result of something that might be changing in the environment. So later on, um, there were other fields of psychology to develop in the 60s, for example. We had humanistic psychology really kind of take off because it was based on environmental conditions, but accepting non-judgmental, uh, positive kind of growth, not looking into the past. Like Sigmund Freud often wanted to look into the past at parent-child relationships in particular, and they really were focused on the future, and the past didn't matter as much. So today we kind of combine all of those things. We combine the study of behavior, what we do. So that would be the behaviorist kind of perspective, observable, measurable kinds of behaviors. How much do you sleep? How many minutes do you sleep? We can watch you, we can time you, we could do that. And then the mental processes, the inner thoughts and feelings. Um, so how attitudes, how are people thinking about something, how do people process information, stuff that um, maybe back in the time of Sigmund Freud you couldn't really see if someone's emotional centers in their brain was activated when presented with a picture of their mother. But today you could see that. You could present a picture of someone's mom, you could have a brain scan, you could see all this has an emotional context to it, and you could see those kinds of things. So um, mental processes, the study of mental processes have really evolved over time. So there's the American Psychological Association. It's the largest organization, great website. I would suggest checking it out, looking at all the different topics that are there. 160,000 members. And so what does contemporary psych look at? All right, so we're going to take a look at its biggest question, how three main levels and subfields. So let's look at the three main levels of analysis. So we've already kind of talked about pretty significantly biological influences. All right, so we we talked about the brain, we talked about the endocrine system, we talked about neurotransmitters. We didn't get into genetics quite yet, but all of this biology has an influence on behavior. So that could be one way to explain behavior. Another way is psychological influences. How do we think about things? How do we respond to our environment emotionally? How do we, when we talk about learning in psychology, oftentimes we're talking about that behavioral model that we learn by associations. Like we got sick after we ate something, so we avoid eating that food because we got sick. Or we do certain behaviors because it brings rewards, or we avoid certain behaviors because it brings consequences. So those kind of learned behaviors, emotions, thinking, those kinds of things. Perception kind of is both. Sensation would be on the biology side. How we process that would be on the psychological side. And then the third level is social cultural influences. So we look at social psychology. How does the individual exist within the context of groups? So we have maybe how we deal with small groups or even partners, attraction, marriages, those kinds of things, but then larger groups as well, whether they're peer groups or societies and cultures, and what kind of influences they have on our behavior. So we can look at any behavior or mental process and how it's influenced from those three areas. And some behaviors might be more heavily influenced by biology, sort of like sexual motivation, influenced tremendously by sex hormones, or we might have fears that on the psychological side that were learned because of something negative happening. You know, you're afraid of dogs because you got bit by a dog when you were 3, or maybe there's just enormous social pressures to behave it in a certain way, and we see all sorts of behaviors in groups that we don't see as an individual. So these are all